So human beings are made to be distracted. This is great when you're foraging for berries and you want to avoid being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. It's horrible to focus in on just one task and not be able to be distracted by something else that might be important. So it's great when you're foraging berries, but when you're trying to measure behavior and you need to focus in on a single behavior for a prolonged period of time and don't break your contact and attention with it, that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, given our human nature. So what do we do as behavior analysts when we need to measure a behavior? Well, the answers are going to come at you today because I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. All right, so today we're going to take a look at measuring behavior, some of the techniques that we can use to accurately measure behavior. But before we get to that, we have to know exactly what measuring behavior is. And for that, we turn to Johnston and Pennypacker. Wait a second. Pennypacker?
Not Pennypacker.
You know him?
I wish I did.
Probably another Pennypacker. Johnston and Pennypacker, in Strategies and Tactics of Human Behavioral Research, mention that measuring behavior involves attaching a number representing an observed extent of a dimensional quantity, to an appropriate unit. The number and the unit together constitute a measure of the object or event. So there is a lot of words in there. So let's break that down a little bit. So what we're looking at when we're measuring a behavior is, first, we're measuring a dimensional quantity. We're measuring something about the behavior, some aspect of the behavior, some dimension of the behavior. And to measure that dimension, we're going to choose an appropriate unit. And then once we have the dimensional quantity and that appropriate unit, then we measure the behavior. We finish the measurement by attaching a number. So let's take a look at this in an example. So let's say that you want to start a fitness program and you want to measure walking. Walking behavior is the one that you want to measure. Well, in order to measure it, we first need to choose a dimensional quantity. I keep saying quality. We're going to do quality measurements, but we need to choose that dimensional quantity. So what are we going to measure? Are we going to measure the number of steps that we've taken? Are we going to measure that dimension of walking? Are we going to measure the distance that we walked? Are we going to use that dimensional quantity? Are we going to measure the time that we walked? Are we going to measure the heart rate that we achieved while we were walking? What dimension of walking are we going to measure? We make that choice. And then once we make that choice, we use the appropriate unit. So if we're measuring the number of steps, then the unit is really simple. It's just the number of steps. If we're measuring distance, are we going to use meters? Are we going to use feet? Are we going to use miles? What is the unit that we're going to use? If we're measuring time, are we going to do it in minutes? Are we going to do it in seconds? If we're tracking heart rate, beats per minute. So we choose the appropriate unit. And then when we measure the behavior, we attach a number to that dimensional quantity and that appropriate unit. So if we took 500 steps, dimensional quantity is steps, appropriate unit is the number of steps, and the number we attached is 500. If we're tracking the distance, dimensional quantity is the actual distance that we go, appropriate unit might be meters, and attaching a number, we might have gone 1,500 meters. So that is how you measure a behavior. And measurement in applied behavior analysis actually entails 3 steps. So the first is identifying the behavior to be measured. So in this case, walking. Next is defining the behavior in observable terms. So what about walking can we observe? So for example, her enjoyment during walking is something that is not easy to observe. So we wouldn't want to define walking behavior in terms of subjective enjoyment, but we can define it in observable terms in terms of the number of times alternating feet touch the ground and move her forward. And then you select an appropriate observation and data recording method. That's the third step. So in this case, she has her fitness tracker that is continuously tracking the number of steps, also probably continuously tracking multiple dimensional quantities on this behavior, such as distance, such as time, which makes it a very effective and appropriate recording method. So those are the 3 things that we are going to do, that we would do in a measurement: identify the behavior, define the behavior in observable terms, and then select the appropriate observation and data recording method. And if you need an overview of those first two steps, the measurable dimensions of behavior, I made a video on that previously, how to measure behavior. So link in the description if you need to refresh your knowledge of how to measure behaviors just in general. And for an intro into the third aspect of selecting a measurement method, I also made a video on that, link also in the description if you need a refresher on that. Because what we're going to be taking a look at today is specifically how to measure and techniques that can be used to measure when continuous recording is not possible. So back to this fitness tracker example. In this case, it is possible to do continuous recording. This individual can use her fitness tracking app to record every instance of walking that she actually does the entire day. Anybody that records their steps during the day is doing this. You're continuously recording every step. You're recording every heartbeat. But this is not always possible to do, especially for some more complicated behaviors. So because of this, researchers and behavior analysts needed to develop techniques that allowed therapists to measure behavior when continuous recording is not possible. And sometimes continuous recording is not possible due to technological limitations. So pre-step tracker, it would be incredibly difficult to record every single step or record every single heartbeat when, before that technology existed. And then also there are human perception and attention limitations. We are just not made to continuously view and continuously observe anything for prolonged periods of time. So if you needed to observe children in a classroom for an hour, good luck doing this continuously and not breaking your attention away from any specific child at any specific moment. So because of these impossibilities of doing continuous recording in numerous types of behavior analysts and researchers have come up with numerous techniques. And we're going to take a look at one class of those techniques today, which is time sampling. So time sampling, these are methods. These are a number of methods. We're going to take a look at three, but these are a number of methods where you can observe and record behavior during intervals, not continuously, but only during intervals. And these occur at specific moments in time. So you divide your observation period. How long do you want to observe a behavior for? You divide that into time intervals. And then you, in general, just record the presence or absence of behavior within or at the end of each of those time intervals. So you're not taking a look at behavior and observing things for an entire hour, which is impossible, but you split it up into time intervals that might last only 10 seconds. And 10 seconds, we can focus. We can focus for 10 seconds. We can do it continuously for those 10 seconds. And we do those intervals throughout the observation period. And that is the basic idea of time sampling. So this time sampling is very useful in a number of examples or a number of instances. One of them is if you need to measure complicated continuous behavior that doesn't have a fitness tracker to measure it. So something like cooperative play. Cooperative play is a continuous behavior. It's hard to tell how many units of cooperative play have occurred in this example here. So it's very easy to tell how many steps a person has taken because those are discrete behavioral instances. But here in cooperative play, what's a unit of cooperative play? You can't count the number of cooperative play that have occurred. So this is great when you need to measure continuous behavior like cooperative play. And then it's also great for measuring behavior where it occurs at a really, really high rate. So maybe it's discrete behaviors, but they occur at such a high rate that it's difficult to distinguish one response from another. But you can detect if it's happening. So just like cooperative play, you can't take a look at the units of cooperative play, but you can easily observe that in this instance, cooperative play is occurring. Even if it's not something continuous like cooperative play, but something more discrete like drumming. So if you can count, or you can try to count the individual hits that this drummer makes on the drum pads, but it's going to be extremely difficult, especially at high rates. So if they're playing the drums and they're like, how many times have they hit those drum pads in that particular, playing? Very difficult to tell, but you can tell if it has occurred, right? Because you can hear the drums, and you can tell oftentimes how long it's occurred. So that's a lot easier. So if you can detect whether or not the behavior is occurring, that is a great time to use time sampling if a continuous monitoring and continuous observation is not possible. So that's the benefits of time sampling. What are the three major ways of doing time sampling? Well, those are whole interval recording, partial interval recording, and momentary time sampling. So we're going to start off with whole interval recording. So again, we're going to go back to this idea of observing cooperative play. Let's say that this is the behavior that you wanted to measure. How much cooperative play does an individual do in an hour, for example? Well, one of the ways that you would do this is not by observing them for an hour, because you try to focus in on a child for an entire hour with your stopwatch. You're going to fail. Our human minds are not made to do that. But what you can do is you can say, all right, I'm going to do some whole interval recording here, and I'm going to take this hour and I'm going to split it up into 10-second intervals. Now, it's really important to understand that these 10-second intervals don't occur back to back to back to back to back. It's not like you're splitting up this hour into 600, that's not how many, 360 10-second intervals, right? We're not doing that for the entire hour. What we do is we split it up into intervals, and those intervals might occur every 5 minutes, right? You might take a look at these children playing for 10 seconds every 5 minutes. So that's where that ability to pay attention for small periods of time comes into play. So it's not like we're just splitting up the entire interval into these little partial intervals. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, at these specific times during the hour, we're going to concentrate and observe these individuals for 10 seconds. So you would have more than 5 intervals in an hour-long observation period if you were doing 10-second intervals. But just for this example, let's say that in that hour, we're only going to observe them 5 times. We're only going to observe these children 5 times, and we're going to observe them for 10 seconds each time. So again, that is something that is humanly possible. If we were doing that, what we might find is that in that first interval, no cooperative play occurs. So let's stop the video here so we don't get too confused. Let's say that in that first interval, no cooperative play occurs whatsoever. So in that interval, we would mark an X, and we would basically say, hey, you know what? In that interval, no cooperative play occurred. Now in the second interval, let's say that they were playing from the time that you started observing during the interval. So as soon as you turned your attention to these children at the beginning of that 10-second interval, they were cooperatively playing. And at the end of the interval, they were cooperatively playing. I'm going to regret choosing this example. They were C playing at the beginning of the interval, and they were C playing at the end of the interval. So for those 10 seconds that you observed them, they were cooperatively playing. Well, in whole interval recording, that would be checked off as a occurrence of the behavior. And the reason is because in whole interval recording, the observation period the behavior needs to occur throughout the observation period. That target behavior needs to occur at the beginning of the observation period, and it needs to keep going until the end of the observation period. If that occurs, if it's at the beginning and at the end, it occurred throughout the entire interval, then that is an instance of that behavior according to whole interval recording. We would record that as, yes, that behavior occurred during that interval. Now, if on the other hand, let's say that we then go to interval number 3. So we're going to be viewing these children playing for another 10 seconds. And when we begin the interval, they're not playing. But then they start playing during those 10-second intervals. So maybe they play together for about like 6 seconds, but then they stop playing before the end of the interval. In whole interval recording, we would indicate that as the behavior has not occurred during that interval. Now, I know it's kind of counterintuitive. The behavior did occur during that interval. But again, this is a definition. This is a method of recording behavior. And in whole interval recording, a behavior is counted as occurring during an interval only if it's occurring at the beginning of the interval and continues to occur until the end of the interval. So in this case, we would indicate no behavior not occurring during that interval. Interval number 4, again, we take a break, come back maybe in 10 minutes, check on the children again. We take a look at interval number 4, we start the timer, and lo and behold, they're playing at the beginning of the interval. So when we look up, when we start that 10-second interval, these children are playing. However, they stop playing before the end of the interval. So maybe they only play for 6 seconds again together, and then they stop playing. It did occur, the behavior was occurring at the beginning of the interval, but because it didn't reach the end of the interval, it didn't occur throughout the interval, again, we would indicate that as an interval where the behavior has not occurred. And then finally, in interval number 5, let's say that we start observing during that interval, we start that 10-second countdown timer, and they're not playing together. But they start playing together somewhere in the middle of the interval, and they're still playing by the end of the interval. Well, that would still be an indication, or that would still be recorded as no play during that time interval. So again, it's a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, clearly play has occurred, but again, this is a technique used for measuring behavior, and it's that whole interval recording where it has to occur during the entire interval. So data collected with this whole interval recording would then be reported as a percentage of total intervals in which a target behavior was recorded as occurring. So in this case, we have one interval out of 5 where we recorded the behavior as occurring. So in this case, our measure that we would report would be 20%. This behavior occurred for 20% of the intervals. So that would be our measure of the behavior. It occurs during 20% of the intervals. And not surprisingly, data obtained with whole interval recording usually underestimates the overall percentage of the actual observation period where the behavior did occur. So here you can see that these children played together approximately half of the time during this play session. However, we only record, according to whole interval recording, 20% of the time. So we have underestimated the amount of actual time that these children spent playing together. But that is one technique, that is whole interval recording. The next technique we're going to take a look at is partial interval recording. And in partial interval recording, what you do is at the end of each interval, you record whether the behavior occurred or whether the behavior did not occur, but you record it as occurring if the behavior occurred at any time during the interval. If at any point during the interval these children engaged in cooperative play, then you would record that interval as having the behavior. So let's clear the decisions from the whole interval recording. And if we were using partial interval recording on the exact same pattern of behavior, so note, we're not changing the pattern of behavior here. Let's say that somebody else was observing these children playing at the exact same intervals, but they were doing partial interval recording. What would they record? Well, in that case, for that first interval, again, no behavior occurred at all during the interval. So they would say, nope, no behavior during that interval. For that second interval, the behavior began at the beginning and went all the way to the end. But what's important for partial interval recording is that the behavior occurred at all. So in this case, they would say, absolutely, during that interval, behavior occurred. So we're going to check that interval as containing that target behavior. For the third interval, again, as long as the behavior occurs within the interval, that would be a recording for partial interval recording, a recording of that behavior. So they would say, yes, the behavior occurred during that interval. For interval number 4, again, cooperative play occurred. So they would say, yes, that behavior has occurred. And for interval number 5, cooperative play occurred at any point during the interval, even if it was only for a second, even if it was only for one little instance of cooperative play, you would indicate yes. And then much like with whole interval recording, the percentage of total intervals in which the target behavior was recorded as occurring would be totaled for your report on the amount of behavior. So in this case, it would be 80%. We would say that the behavior occurred 80% of the time or in 80% of the intervals. And in this case, it actually overestimates. So unlike the whole interval recording, partial interval recording overestimates how much behavior has actually occurred. So partial interval recording is also, it's much easier to do than whole interval recording. And because you only have to record an instance of the behavior, it's actually possible to measure multiple behaviors concurrently. So you can measure cooperative play, and you can measure, for example, eye contact, and you can measure facing towards your play partner. You can measure all those 3 behaviors with partial interval recording, because as soon as a behavior occurs, you can tick it off on that interval and you no longer have to pay attention for that behavior, and you can divert your attention to another behavior. So it's possible, one of the advantages of partial interval recording is that it's possible to record multiple behaviors concurrently. All right, and then the last major type of time sampling is momentary time sampling. And in momentary time sampling, you only look at the end of the interval. And at the end of the interval, the observer records whether the target behavior occurred just if it's still occurring at the end of the interval. If it's occurring at the moment that that interval ends, that is recorded as the behavior having occurred. So again, let's take a look at the exact same pattern of behavior. Let's take off those conclusions from partial time recording or partial interval recording, and now we're going to take a look at momentary time sampling. So in this case, that first example, no cooperative play, we would indicate that in momentary time sampling, as behavior has not occurred. In that second interval, behavior occurs throughout the entire interval. However, the only important thing for momentary time sampling is that it's occurring at the end of the interval. Is the behavior still going on when that interval ends? And for interval number 2, it most certainly is. For interval number 3, the behavior is not occurring at the end of the interval. Even though it occurred during the interval, it's not still going by the end. So we would say no, the behavior did not occur during that interval. For behavior number 4, interval started with the behavior occurring, cooperative play, but the cooperative play ended before the interval ended. So momentary time sampling would say no to that interval as well. And then for interval number 5, we can see that the cooperative play didn't start at the beginning of the interval, but it was definitely still going at the end of the interval. So momentary time sampling would say yes, that is a instance of that behavior. So once again, the report that you would give would be the percentage of your total intervals in which the target behavior occurred. And in this case, it's 40%. And one of the kind of magical things about momentary time sampling is that it can both overestimate and underestimate your percentages of behavior, but it actually is the one that comes the closest to the actual amount of behavior that occurs during an interval if you choose your intervals correctly. And there's a lot of research on how long those intervals should be that we don't have time to get into, but there does seem to be a little bit of magic of just recording that final period in your time interval and whether or not the behavior is occurring. Because as you can see here, our estimate of 40%, which we got with momentary time sampling, is actually the closest estimate that we've had in these examples. So that is one of the big advantages of momentary time sampling. It seems counterintuitive that it might be the best one, but it does have that advantage. And also, the observer in this case does not have to attend continuously to the measurement. So this is the one method where you really only have to attend for maybe a second at a time. So it's just at that end of the interval, you look up, you see the behavior, you check off on your interval scorecard, and that's it. And you can go attend to other matters. But that advantage also has a flip side disadvantage where a lot of behavior is going to be missed with momentary time sampling. And because of that, you can't do multiple behaviors. Because of that, you might miss a lot of activity that maybe you weren't measuring, but you should be measuring. And those kind of suggestions would not occur to you. Those kinds of observations would not occur with this momentary time sampling. All right, so that is it for what I wanted to cover today on time sampling. So today we discussed measuring behavior and some of the challenges in measuring behavior continuously. We took a look at the ways to overcome that challenge, which is time sampling, and we talked about whole interval recording, where you split an observation session into multiple intervals, and the behavior has to occur during the whole interval for it to be counted. We looked at partial interval recording, where the behavior only has to occur at some point during the interval to be recorded. And then we talked about momentary time sampling, where the behavior only has to be occurring at the end of the interval for it to be recorded, and how those underestimate for whole interval, overestimate for partial interval, and underestimate, overestimate for monetary time sampling the actual amount of behavior that occurs. So that is all that I wanted to cover for today. Next time, we're going to take a look at measuring behavior by permanent product. Ooh, what's that? Permanent products. Sounds fancy. Really, it's pretty simple. But until next time, stay frosty, stay functional, and go modify some behavior. All right. Looks like we're ready to go. Okay. So human beings are made to be distracted.